All right, all of a sudden, everybody's back. It's almost like a Star Trek episode, you know? It's like you just get beamed up and all of a sudden you're there. Well, great to see everybody. So I put you into breakout rooms and was just kind of asking you to sort of think through what are some of the kinds of things that you are trying to communicate when you host someone, or what are some things that you would like or have had communicated to you when you've been hosted. So what are some things that you came up with? What are some things you discussed in your groups?
One of the things that we talked about, that we prepare and that we're ready and we have the food all set, but also in doing so that we're communicating that that the people are important, and just to be sensitive to their needs as well. If they have any food concerns, that we have thought about that and have made preparation for that, or even have asked them previously, so that we're prepared as well.
So preparing is like getting prepared is a major component of it. And as you do that, you're imagining in your mind's eye, right, the persons and what would make them feel welcome,
Mm-hmm.
right? What would make them feel at home? What would be safe for them to eat, right? That's a key component. That's very important. That's great, Tom. What are some other things that any of you share? Looks like the Popes have their mic turned on.
Well, I wanted to give a call out to Janet Hagberg because she had a creative contribution. She said she doesn't much like to cook, so one of her favorite things is a potluck where everybody contributes to it, and that's a whole different take on it, but it accomplishes maybe better a way of getting everyone involved and everyone a part of the meal.
That's great. Janet, did you talk a little bit about sort of not just the motivation behind that in terms of not having to cook, but are there some other components?
Yes, partly I'm not gifted with culinary delights like other people are. But the other thing is it gives me a chance to focus more for me on how the relationships can be built in the evening and not just be around the food, which is fine, and the hostessing, but I really like engaging people in questions and deeper things. For me, that's just one of my needs. So I love when I don't have to spend all my energy on all the food in advance. It's really survival.
Well, and potluck probably makes it easier in terms of cleanup too. Because and I say that because I'm almost always the one who does the dishes in our house. Jules is the one who cooks, and Jonah, my son, is becoming a really good cook, but I've never been very good at cooking. But I can scrub a pan. I can scrub a pan with the best of them.
I think small and simple would be my 2 words for how I entertain.
Yeah. That's great. That's great. So building relationships, and that's one of the reasons, right, why we have these kinds of events, is to build relationships, to affirm relationships, right, to embark into new relationships, and so hosting, and particularly with a meal or something of that nature, has this function and has always had this function. And I think it's helpful as we're moving through and we're thinking about the Lord's Supper that we can draw on. Obviously, there are some ways we should say that the Lord's Supper is quite unique, right? It's a symbolic ritual kind of event, and it has some unique characteristics. But there's other ways in which it cuts across things that we all do with one another, right? Particularly with folks that we maybe don't live with, but we have supper together, we break bread together, we fellowship with one another. And the experiences there that happen there, the things that we think about or that we maybe we don't reflect on them, but we do think about them in preparation for them. That can also inform how we think about what God is trying to say to us and what we should be trying to say to one another when we participate in the Lord's Supper. So this is a helpful sort of background kind of thing. Well, let me turn us to, oh, go ahead, Tom.
Yeah. No, it's Elgin.
Oh.
One of the thoughts that occurs to me is that meals are an expectation of a positive experience. And so I would look at the Lord's Supper as an expectation of a positive, enriching experience.
Yeah, that's actually great. And typically, actually, when you say that, I really appreciate that, Elgin, because in, when we were going through the congregationalism class and we were talking, one of the things about when folks would come to church, to the meeting house, there was a sense of expectancy, right? They typically focused it on the word, right? That you were expecting to hear something. But I think this is actually really helpful in terms of thinking about the Lord's Supper, because we may or may not hear something there. But one of the things about the Lord's Supper that's so great is that it kind of goes beyond words, right? In some ways, it's precognitive, perhaps, or supercognitive. It transcends some of the words, and so that sense of expectancy, even to be met there, and to meet one another there, I think that's right. It's a great point. All right. Well, these are great thoughts. Let me shift us now. I'm going to share my screen. And we are on YouTube. Okay. So, all right. So we're in session 2, meeting Christ at the table. You've had a few minutes to have a conversation where we were using some of our just daily or sort of semi-weekly maybe events of hosting people or being hosted, and what are some of the messages that are encoded in those experiences. A useful exercise, I hope, for you as you think about the Lord's Supper and what that experience can be like. I just want to quickly kind of remind us from last week what we talked about, and if you didn't get a chance to check it out, last week's session is available on YouTube. So you can always go back and watch that if you didn't have a chance. So we talked through pretty much kind of an introduction, I would say, last week. What I wanted to do is to share with you what I think are some of the big questions connected to the Lord's Supper, the questions that I am going to try my best to provide us spaces to wrestle with. Questions like, what does the Lord's Supper tell us about who God is? What does it tell us about who we are, what it means to be human? What does it tell us about the nature of creation, how God thinks about the created order? What happens in the Lord's Supper, right? That's a big question that Christians have wrestled with, and there's been a lot, of course, disagreement around that. So we went through, kind of cataloged a few of those at the beginning, just to sort of give us a sense about these are the kinds of things, questions, et cetera, that we're going to try and engage. I mentioned the multidimensionality of the supper in part because it really gives us a significant challenge. A 5-week class, trying our best to do justice to a really multi-layered and central practice for Christians from the very beginning, very get-go. So I was kind of trying to put an apologia out there at the beginning to say I'm not going to be able to deal with every little thing, and also to recognize that there are lots of differences too in this regard, and we're going to do our best to sort of maybe stay in the center, I suppose. As an example of that multidimensionality, then I introduced to you some of the most common names that have been used, and there were 5 of them that I talked through in the history of the church. So Eucharist, Lord's Supper, Holy Communion, the Mass, and the Synaxis. And we went through sort of the backgrounds of those and what traditions those are, et cetera, and had an interesting conversation around that. I then, at the end, offered to you what I am pretty much the way that I'm going to approach this in terms of a sort of theological framework, utilizing sort of two broad categories, right? That God is fundamentally hospitable, right? That one of the ways that God is that God hosts, right? And we utilize some of the creation story. I kind of highlighted a few places here and there in the Hebrew Bible. Isaiah 25 was one of those, right? That salvation itself is portrayed as a great banquet. And then we turned and we talked about the table fellowship of Jesus, right? That one of the ways that Jesus was Jesus, one of the ways that he went around extending forgiveness, teaching, etc., was by extending table fellowship. And so I said that, of course, in the rationale for bringing that one in particular was, of course, the primary background for the Lord's Supper in some sense is what's called the Last Supper, right, which occurs on the night that Jesus is about to be handed over to the Roman authorities. But that's just one of several meals, right, that Jesus is involved in. In fact, I didn't mention this, but there was one commentator who I've been teaching through Luke, and he said that it seems like Jesus eats his way through the Gospel of Luke. He's constantly having meals with people. So the point, though, is just to say that this is not a sort of discrete, event that sort of just happens once in the life of Jesus. This is something that Jesus is constantly doing. Right? He's constantly sharing the table with people, and it's a whole variety. Right? That was part of the other point, was that it's not just that he's there with his friends. It's not just that he's there with his disciples. Right? He sits down with quote unquote sinners. He sits down with the outcasts. He sits down with his enemies. And of course, the Last Supper happens and Judas is there, right? So the everyone literally is welcome, essentially, at Jesus's table. And of course, I kind of was making a push, and that I think that should definitely always be the process and practice that we have, which we currently do have, that it's an open table. So that's kind of what we went over last week. What I'd like to do this week is we're going to be dealing with a little bit of the biblical background for the supper, and then I'm going to set up sort of the approach that we're going to have as we move through the last 3 weeks together. So the biblical and social background is kind of what we're going to be doing today. And basically, the first point that I just want to make is that when we start out talking about the Lord's Supper, which is the case with any kind of really central, like, Christian practice or Christian, like, article of faith, I suppose, in some ways it's going to be rooted in, it's going to be kind of part of a conversation about the development of early Christianity, right? How is the early church going about doing this thing that we now do? How does what we do relate to what they did? How has it changed, etc.? So what's the continuity? What's some of the change, etc.? One of the things that has kind of, as I've been sort of working on this class, one of the things that's become clearer to me, actually, is how central this meal was to the early Christians. And even once you start, I think it was like last week, I started to mention, and we started to have conversations around eating and things like that related to Jesus, etc. And I've been reading these other texts, one of which I left on the plane coming back from the funeral. So I'm kind of sad I lost a $100 book on the plane. But it was talking about, that meals were central not only in helping the community shape itself, right, because that was the place in some ways where the church fully would show up, in a sense, because everyone would be gathered, but that the sharing of the supper was also at the center of how the church was going to live out its mission. And so one way that we can read the arguments about inclusion of Gentiles in, say, the letters of Paul or the book of Acts is that it's a question about who can we eat with, right? And that is the way that it's framed, actually, when Peter goes to Antioch, right? He won't eat with the Gentiles, and Paul rebukes him for that. And so So my point is just that this thing that we're talking about, the Lord's Supper, is not just like a stodgy, unimportant, religious ritual. It really played a central role in how the Christian community became itself, right? How it regulated itself, how it shaped itself, etc. So we want to keep that in mind. As we look at it, what we see, kind of when you look at it, what you see is, in terms of development, that there's sort of, I would argue, and I'm going to present to you today, three important contexts, three important background contexts, two of which are biblical antecedent contexts. And then another is a broader development that's going on in the world as the Christian community is coming into being. So that first century, second century, in the Roman that Roman period, late antiquity. So in terms of the biblical backgrounds, there are two. One of them is the Passover, and I want to talk through sort of the Passover context. And then the other is a meal that's known as the Tota, and this is a Jewish thank offering meal. And I'm going to argue that both of these are important as for helping us understand the way that Christians were understanding what they were doing in the Lord's Supper. In terms of Passover, in terms of Passover, there has, at least in the history of the church, and this oftentimes will appear, in terms of when churches are arguing about how do they, the differences that they have about the supper, or this question will also appear around Easter, typically, and that's the question of exactly what is the relationship between the Lord's Supper and Passover. Is the Lord's Supper the Christian sort of innovation on the Passover meal, or is it something a little bit different than that? And so I'm gonna offer to you a couple of ways of thinking about this that's going to bring in both of these dynamics. And actually, this is sort of my point here. So as I say here, a consistent question regarding the Lord's Supper is its relationship to Passover. Should it be understood as an extension of the Passover meal, or was it simply a Jewish fellowship meal? And I think what we see actually, and I'll put this before you, what you see is that it's both. There's both a Passover element, there's a Passover framework, but then there's also this other framework that helps to explain a lot of the innovations that Christians are going to make. And again, as we go through these, I think also the significance and importance of participating in Passover, what the meaning of that was. You'll hear the resonances there, I think, probably that echo to some extent what you've experienced perhaps when you've heard pastors or others either preach on or teach on or talk about the Lord's Supper. And maybe this is also connected to your own experiences as well. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the Passover context, which is the first one. In just a second, we'll spend a few minutes also reading the Exodus passage where it comes from. So there's good evidence that points towards a Passover context as an essential background for understanding the Christian celebration of the Lord's Supper. The first is that in the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, John, and in one of the kind of the oldest text really, which is 1 Corinthians chapter 11, all of these point towards a meal that was held with Jesus and his disciples in the evening. Now, in ancient practice, you would almost never eat at night unless you were doing something that was a festival kind of meal. So in that case, this offers to us a piece of evidence that says, okay, if Jesus, when he's gathering with his disciples in the evening, this has some sort of religious ritual component to it. And of course, Jesus himself talks about the Passover in those contexts. The second thing, aside from that first one, is that in all of the Gospels, the posture that Jesus and the disciples assume is indicative of some sort of a festival meal. What I mean by that is reclining, the posture of reclining. It is very definitely true that in the ancient world, when people ate, they typically sat on the floor. But if you were having a festival meal, you would do something like you would recline. So you might lay to your side, or you might lay in a way, such a way that your feet went out the back, and you were kind of on an elbow, perhaps. And being able to recline, by the way, was a mark of high social stature, at least in that circle, whatever it was. So reclining and serving demarcated two different classes of people, which is why it's so important that in some of those scenes we hear about Jesus himself serving his disciples, right? And we hear about God saying that God is going to host a meal and serve us at that meal. So that's a way that in a sense is a way of kind of showing the kind of egalitarian spirit, I suppose we might say. Then it's Jesus's words, right? When he picks up the bread and he takes up the cup, he talks about them as these are covenantal signs and symbols, right? This bread is my body broken for you. This wine is my blood, which poured out for you towards a new covenant. All of that stuff clearly resonates with Passover as a significant background. And Paul himself in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7, offers, this, what we might say as a gloss, in which he says, Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us, therefore let us keep the feast. So even Paul is talking about this. So Passover, again, really is significant, right? And that's why then it's justified, it seems to me, that we turn here in just a second and we talk a little bit about kind of the passage that Passover comes from. So here's just a couple of things that we can say before we read the passage regarding this framework. Passover was meant to be celebrated once a year, right? So it was meant to be an annual celebration. It is clearly connected, obviously, you may or may not know, but it was the meal instituted just before God rescues the people of Israel out of Egypt. So it's connected with that rescue liberation motif that's so central to the story of Israel, and in particular in the context of Egypt. And then it contains a significant component of self-offering or sacrifice, we might say. That terminology is very much present there, and the self-offering is on God's part. God is the one who ultimately is going to be doing the rescuing, right? God is ultimately the one who is going to be leading the people out of Egypt. All right, let me stop there just for a second and see if there are any comments or questions that folks have.
Can we do the reclining thing the next time we get together for communion at church?
Heck yeah, man. It certainly is easier, I suppose, to do it at home. You got your couch there, I suppose.
Go.
I'm looking at all of this and listening to this and everything, and there are no women. It's all male oriented. And did the women ever come to the banquets, or did they just sit in the kitchen and eat leftovers, or what?
Well, that's a great
women.
Yeah, so this is a great point, Suzanne. You're actually touching on something that's going to come back in just a minute. One of the things is that when you have a Passover meal, it typically is a family affair. So everyone's there, the women, the men, the children.
Okay.
And so when we look at the story of what's going on at the quote unquote Last Supper, it's typically only the male disciples that are there, which is going to be one of the reasons why it raises the kind of question, was this actually a Passover meal, or was it connected to the Passover, but not necessarily a Passover meal? So typically women would be participating. That's right.
Someone's got to be preparing it.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
But
And I think there's some indication that the women do some of the preparatory work in Mark's account, but they are not portrayed as necessarily being present in the event. And that's one of the questions then that leads us to the second category that we want to bring in as well. So thank you, Suzanne's got her feminist interpretation lens on. She's zoned in. Absolutely right.
Reality.
Other comments? That's right. Other comments, other observations.
During the Passover service, they.
All right. Well, let's turn. Can I get a volunteer?
Probably.
Go ahead, Tom.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was thinking I was muted. But no, during the Passover service, there's a portion called the Afikomen, where they break apart the last piece of matzah, and which has been hidden away, and pass that around along with the last cup, cup of blessing. So, which became the communion service.
Oh, so that would be So if it's going to evolve out of Passover, then that would be the argument that it came from that.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I appreciate that. All right. This is great. So can I get a volunteer? Thanks for that comment, Tom. Who is willing to read our passage from Exodus 12?
Yeah. Probably do that.
All right. Looks like Tom's going to read for us.
Sure.
That's great.
Got to get close enough here. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month shall mark you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you. Tell the whole congregation of Israel that on the 10th of this month, they are to take a lamb for each family, a lamb for each household. If a household is too small for a whole lamb, it shall join its closest neighbor to obtaining one. The lamb shall be divided in portions to the number of people who eat it. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a year-old male. You shall take it from the sheep or from the goats. You shall keep it until the 14th day of this month. Then the whole assembled congregation shall slaughter it at twilight. They shall take some of the blood and put it on the doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. They shall eat the lamb on the same night. They shall roast it over the fire with the unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled in water, but roasted over fire with its head, leg, and inner organs. You shall let none of it remain until morning. Then that remains until morning you shall burn it. This is how you shall eat it. Your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, your staff in your hand. You shall eat it hurriedly. It is the Passover of the Lord. For I will pass through the land that night, and I will strike down the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both human beings and animals. On all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you live. When I see the blood, I will pass over, and no plague shall destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. This is the day of remembrance for you. You shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord. Throughout your generations, you shall observe it as a perpetual ordinance."
Awesome. Thank you very much, Tom. That's great. I think you probably deserve an award for that. It's a long passage. Okay, so right, we offered some kind of initial data for the background here in terms of Passover as central, and I just want to kind of highlight a couple of key components, basically from the passage, components that I think speak into, to a certain extent, ways that we might want to think about the Lord's Supper, particularly as we're going to move into discussing the themes more directly starting next week together. The first is the setting of the Passover meal itself, right? It occurs in the setting of a crisis or one of jeopardy, right? Right. I mean, the Lord is about to execute judgment. The people are supposed to, have all their clothes on, prepared to leave, run out the door. In fact, there's some archaeological evidence that one of the ways that some Jews developed ways of kind of mimicking this was actually to create small sandwiches where you could have, the matzah, the lamb, and the bitter herbs all together, and you could eat it very quickly in that regard. So that wasn't necessarily what caught on for everyone, but they took this quite seriously. Now, in this particular case, and this is going to be a distinction, I think, to some extent, when we talk about the Lord's Supper, but in this case, the community is threatened from without, right? The Israelites are threatened by the bondage and slavery, by the threats from Pharaoh, etc., and they have to be rescued. Now, when we turn and we talk about the Lord's Supper, though, there is a threat that's external, but that threat is also internal, right? Because what's the context of the Last Supper? It's the night in which Jesus is handed over, right? Which can also be translated and often is the night in which he's betrayed. And in fact, the one who is going to especially betray him is at the table. And if we think through actually a number of things, it's not just one person who betrays Jesus. I mean, Peter also turns his back on Jesus. Other disciples are going to flee. So in other words, the whole company of disciples, in some sense, is in jeopardy, right? When the meal is actually going on in Jesus's presence. And that shares then this echo to some extent with the Passover meal, that this is a moment of crisis, that in some sense that the church, the community is always threatened or always is on sort of the brink to a certain extent. And maybe we realize that sometimes, maybe sometimes that's more evident to us and other times it's not as evident, but nevertheless, this is an important component certainly of the meaning of the meal. The second thing, of course, is that crisis is not the only thing, right, that's going on, right? In fact, that's not the most important thing. The most important thing, in a sense, is the context of God's liberative action, that God is coming to rescue the people. And I think that also, to some extent, echoes into the context of the Last Supper. Jesus's life is going to be threatened and, of course, forfeited. And yet there's also a sense in which, certainly as we have come to know the story, but even perhaps Jesus himself saying, nevertheless, I will do God's will, all right? That somehow God will deliver whatever that looks like, and I think if we want to kind of step back before the resurrection with no notion that it's going to happen, and maybe Jesus does know God's going to raise him from the dead, but there is certainly a sense in which even if he doesn't know that, he's willing to still remain faithful, right? Because God is going to deliver. So that also then echoes into the Passover, because in the Passover context, the meal itself is symbolic and actually is going to be part of the process of liberating the people, right? Because part of what they do when they cook the meal, when they make the meal, they take some of the blood of the lamb and they put it on their doorposts. So the meal itself becomes sort of a symbol that means, or that indicates to them that God is the one who rescues. So as I say here, Yahweh is going to destroy the powers that enslave Israel. And when you participate in this meal, you're making plain that you have an allegiance to Yahweh and to Yahweh's community. So there's an allegiance element here. And I'm going to turn to this in just a second, which in the third thing, this is sort of, I would say, the most sort of straightforward. And that is that this is a covenantal meal. Now, a covenant, we've talked about this, I think, during the class on congregationalism. I think we've preached on this recently, but just to sort of remind ourselves, covenant is a way of describing an ordered relationship between two parties that includes kind of rights and responsibilities between those two parties. Typically, covenants in the ancient world also included the invocation of some sort of divine presence. You were making a promise to someone in God's presence and asking God to uphold or to hold you accountable, whatever the case may be. Now, that being the case, oftentimes when one made promises, one did some sort of symbolic action to seal that, right? To make it evident that that's what you were doing. And one of the symbolic actions that we find in the ancient world when covenants were being made was to eat a meal together, right? And that could have different kinds of meanings depending on what you ate and the postures that you assumed. So I think it's safe to say, though, that this is also, this meal, the Passover meal, has a covenantal character to it, right? It has to do with God's promise, but also with Israel's promise back to God. Now, what are a couple of other things that we can say in regards to that? One of which is one that I mentioned just a moment ago, and that is that it both symbolizes, but it also offers the provision of rescue, right? And what I mean here is God is nourishing the people. God is giving them some foods they might not normally eat, right? The bitter herbs, things like that, to remind them that there is always sort of a potential threat, that you need God, essentially, right? But the meal also offers provision because it supplies the blood that's going to be placed on the doorposts, etc. So it has both a symbolic and even more than that symbolic meaning in terms of what it seeks to affect. And what are some ways that it seeks to affect? One is, and here I'm using the language that Congregationalists have especially used, which is it seals something, right? They've typically talked about, Congregationalists talked about baptism and the Lord's Supper as seals of faith. They were practices, rituals, if you will, that people underwent or participated in. And one of the things that the participation meant was that you had been sealed. You had had the impress of God's promise placed upon you in this offering of water or of bread and wine. So a sealing here element. The meal, as I say here, the meal is the basis of God's, it's the basis for protection from God's judgment of the other gods. We already mentioned that just a moment ago. The meal, though, also means in the Passover context that God is basically saying he's going to protect them. Yahweh is going to step in and deliver them out of Egypt. And even though judgment is going to happen, that judgment is not going to fall upon Israel. It's going to fall upon, rather, the enemies of Israel. So it's both a sign of God's provision and the provision itself. So the meal happens in the setting of a crisis and one of jeopardy. It happens in the context in which God is about to liberate the people, and it has a promissory character to it, right? It's a promise, and in some ways it's more than a promise because it also realizes part of that promise, right? In the sense that the people actually are delivered through participating in this meal. And then lastly, the last thing that I think is important in terms of echoing with some of the themes that we're going to wind up picking up is that this is a meal that didn't just happen once, way back when, right? We hear already even at the end in verse 14 that this is a festival that's should be repeated essentially. And of course, over time, that repetition happened once a year according to the festival calendar that was developed in Israel. So what does it mean to repeat it? Well, it means in a sense to renew your commitment, right? And also to, in some sense, have God renewed God's commitment to you, right? To come back again and again. So there's a kind of renewing element here. So the repetition is not just because it's a nice thing to do, not just because we might have forgotten, though we might, but rather a sort of renewal element, and a chance to be touched again by God's provision and liberating power. And as I say here, the people in the midst of that repetition each year, the people are offering thanks to God, the one who provides and liberates, and they're reminded that this is the God who they worship, right? That the God of Israel is the God who brought Israel out of Egypt, and that's sort of central to the identity of Yahweh. And I think for Christians, we could say central to the identity of the God whom we worship, the God and Father of Jesus Christ, is that God raised Jesus from the dead, right? That central action, that's what defines who God is. All right, so let me stop for just a second before I switch to our second biblical context and see if there are any comments or questions that you might have.
We have any evidence that the firstborn were killed? And if so, how God executed that?
Well, all we have is, I mean, my understanding at least, so there may be some other archaeological stuff. There may be some materials in Egyptian archives or whatever, but what we have is basically the witness in Exodus, right? In which it basically talks about that children just, it sounds like they just died. So like I think there was one where the child is asleep and they can't rouse them or whatever. But that's as far as I could say. And yeah, and I mean, getting into the problematics of all that, which may be what you're putting a finger on, I'm going to leave that to a different class. I'm going to sidestep that a little bit.
Christian, as far as that goes, anything that was demeaning to Egyptians, they erased. Like there was one pharaoh that took on the worship of one god, and they kind of erased his name from a lot of monuments. So there's probably not a lot of documentation if it did as happen as the biblical account went.
Right.
One of the other covenantal patterns that we see in this, especially from John 14, is a marriage covenant between the bridegroom and the bride.
Yep.
I go to prepare a place for you, and this is the sharing of that cup of renewing the vows there. And we see at the end of Revelation, the marriage supper.
Right, the Feast of the Lamb. That's right. Yeah.
So it's
right. And
do this in remembrance of me, and all that we're entering into a covenant with Jesus.
Right, and I think especially, and maybe this is also part of the point that you're getting at too, is that it's not just any old promise that typically is made in the context of covenantal agreements, right? They're kind of life and death promises, or promises of the most intimate sort, in a sense, were oftentimes regulated in these kinds of relationships. And I think for sure we see that in this case. I also know that marriage, like in terms of marriage, you had not only a covenantal meal, but you had the covenantal act of sexual intercourse, because that was understood to be the covenantal sign of two becoming one, essentially, was sort of the indication there, in terms of the way that was understood. But yeah, a covenant was and is, it speaks of very intimate promises and a very intimate relationship. And so renewing those vows, right, renewing those commitments, this enabled one to do that. Now, exactly when the the actual like today, there's a very specific. You have 4 glasses of wine. You have certain amount of bitter herbs. There's a certain number of passages that have to be read, etc. Precisely when all of that came into being as a part of the process is not entirely clear. And whether or not Jesus himself was celebrating that way or some other way is also not entirely clear. But it definitely has these resonances that we've highlighted here. All right, let me move us then. So we have the Passover context, we have these backgrounds, but there's a second background that's also important, and that's the Jewish Tota. And basically, Tota is a word for thank offering or fellowship meal. So it can have kind of either sort of meanings. And scholars effectively have turned to this in part because there is some evidence in the biblical stories. Clearly, the Passover is a big context, that's a background. But if it's the only background, then it creates other kinds of questions regarding how Christians evolved the Last Supper, or not the Last Supper, but the Lord's Supper into the practice that it became, something that was happening every time they got together, typically. Was there originally a meal and also a ritual part, and then that those two were pulled apart, or was the whole meal a ritual, et cetera? So those are all sort of the questions that are in the background. I don't want to get into too much of the weeds of that, but let me just kind of go through. Here is a couple of the things that has led scholars to point to this other practice that could also be a part of a Passover celebration, but that was not precisely the same thing, right? And so I think, and so the argument is that it's both the Passover, but also this that then forms the background and then can help us to understand some of the key dynamics that are at play in the Lord's Supper. So what are some of those? Number one, first of all, is the fact that Passover is celebrated annually, right? Like that is once a year. And early Christian texts at least indicate that that Christians were celebrating the Lord's Supper way more often than once a year. Now, whether they were doing it every week is not entirely clear, but it was definitely something that was happening with a greater frequency. So how is that the case? How did that evolve? Is sort of the question. The second one, of course, has to do actually with the scene of the Last Supper, which we already mentioned because Suzanne had perceptibly noted, right, that there's no women, essentially, that seem to be present in the event of the Last Supper. And that's odd because Passover has always been a family affair. It's something that the women, the children, and the men all participate the same. And so why is it the case that that's not happening in the context of the Last Supper, which then becomes the basis for the Lord's Supper? The third thing is the issue of what kind of bread should be used. And this is actually one that I've always kind of wondered about myself. Almost all the Eastern Orthodox churches, pretty much from the very beginning, the Eastern churches, and I'm talking here particularly about churches on the eastern side of the Mediterranean basin, and then further east into Persia and places like that as the church spread, they have always used leavened bread for the bread at the service, whereas churches in the West have typically used unleavened bread. Well, in the context of Passover, leaven is strictly forbidden. You're not even supposed to have leaven in your house, let alone have it in your bread. So exactly how did that evolve? That's sort of the question, is how did a significant number of Christian churches come to use leavened bread as opposed to unleavened, and which one was first? We don't really know exactly how to answer that question, but those are a component of that. Additionally, the Gospel of John and Paul both indicate that Jesus's death occurs before Passover. Right? So the question about when the Passover meal was supposed to happen, was it supposed to happen on the Sabbath, that marked the Passover? Was it supposed to happen a day before or not? These are also historical questions that are open. But certainly the Gospel of John has a different timeline than the other synoptic Gospels regarding when exactly Jesus died. He dies around Passover, but he does not die on Passover. And then the Gospel of Mark offers a number of indications that seem to place the timing of the Last Supper not so much on the Passover day when you would have had the Passover festival, but rather on a day of preparation leading up to it. So you don't need to know all of these pieces of data. I'm just simply putting them there to say to you that Passover is definitely, it's definitely there, but whether or not the Last Supper was happening precisely on Passover is not as settled as some might think, given the fact that we have a lot of this other counter evidence. And so this has led to thinking about another festival option that we find in the Old Testament, which is the thank offering, right? It's sort of the thank offering meal. And as I'll point out in just a minute, this comes out of Leviticus chapter 7. So the Jewish Tota is the one that has typically been brought forward in terms of the scholarship that I've been able to engage. And that is essentially a thank offering or fellowship meal. And I'll describe it, kind of its components in just a second. And you can see, I think, as we bring in, we have the Passover context, we have the elements from that, and this thank offering component is also interestingly provides then I think some important background for how Christians were starting to think about the Lord's Supper from the very beginning. And if you remember, almost synonymous with the words Supper of the Lord or Lord's Supper was the word Eucharist, right? The thanksgiving, right? So that's important. So what can we say about the Jewish Tota? Number one is it seems to kind of have as its design the idea that a person has experienced a situation of jeopardy or crisis, right? That is, they have had an illness, a calamity of some type. Maybe there was an environmental calamity that wiped out all their cattle or their sheep or whatever, or maybe they were on their deathbed or something like that. Or perhaps they were in bondage. They had to sell themselves into slavery to pay off their debts or whatever. But the idea is that that either that is a situation that has been resolved, or that it is a situation in which they believe it will be resolved by God, and they are going to offer thanks to God in that regard. So that's sort of the background. So it's the idea of divine deliverance from death, illness, persecution, or bondage with an offering of thanksgiving. And that's what you offer. You're not offering, the blood or anything of that nature. You are the gift that is given to God is not the animal. It's rather the thanksgiving for what God has done on your behalf. And that seems, I think, to fit quite well, actually, with some of what we hear in the Eucharist. So the backdrop here, I'm not going to read the text. You can go take a look at it yourself. Is Leviticus chapter 7, verses 11 through 15. It's a very short little section, and there's a number of kind of innovations that kind of fly off of it. But let me talk about some of the takeaways that I think are worth noting in terms of the way that early Christians were celebrating the Lord's Supper, and perhaps they were operating also with this form of meal, this kind of ritual form of meal in the background of their minds. So what are some of the takeaways if we read in there? Well, one of the most important takeaways, which I think helps us to understand how the early church, how you have some churches that use leavened bread and others that use unleavened, is that this meal actually allows for that. So this meal says you can have either unleavened cakes or leavened cakes, either one. So you can use leavened bread. This is the kind of meal that is not subject to only being celebrated once a year. It can be celebrated often. And typically, even if the meal has a focus on a particular person being delivered from duress, nevertheless, it was a meal that was meant to be celebrated in common with others, right? So together, folks were giving thanks to God for this deliverance of this person, or perhaps you could certainly extend that out, and it could be a kind of deliverance for the whole community. As I say here on your outline, from my perspective especially, I think this is particularly important, which is that the sacrificial animal is not understood as that which is given to God. It's rather the thanksgiving that pleases God. And I thought, as I was kind of reflecting on this, I thought this really fits actually quite well with a number of things that we see as we think about the relationship that God has to the temple, the issue of what is it that God really wants. Does God want is God out for blood, or does God want something else? And what God seems to want, what is offered, and what makes God happy is a sense of thanksgiving, a sense of connection, and a confession of sort of dependence and relationship with God. And so here then it's the orientation of the heart. Right, that's what's really being offered essentially in a meal like this, as opposed to some sort of sacrifice, and that fits rather profoundly with a number of texts. So here I provided for you a series of texts where we find that the person typically talking is saying something like, "God, you do not desire, the horns of bulls and rams or the blood of goats. What you really want is a thanksgiving of praise. What you really want is the heart," right? That's what God wants. That's what we're being called to offer. So I think this helps even to reshape the way we think about the terminology sacrifice. That sacrifice, oftentimes when we use that language, it carries the connotation of having a victim. And in this case, there is no victim, right? This is the kind of sacrifice that it might be better for us to describe like a parent sacrifices so that their child can go to college, right? There's no victim in that use of sacrifice. And I think that might be a way of thinking about what is offered, even in regards to Jesus. Like Jesus himself is not, God's not out for Jesus's blood. Rather, what's offered by Jesus is his life. So very importantly, right, the context is the thanksgiving. It's the giving of thanks, right? And I've offered to you here, so you have a series of texts up here that come from the Old Testament, from the Hebrew Bible, that give this orientation. But then there are a couple of important texts also in the book of Hebrews that also seem to fit very nicely with this notion of the sacrifice of praise, or of the idea of presenting our bodies as a living sacrifice, right? So that sense of thanksgiving, putting our bodies in a certain kind of posture. So what does all this mean then? What I would say that all this kind of comes down to, in a sense, is that in terms of the biblical background, Passover offers to us a big, broad frame for thinking about some of what's happening in the supper, while this Thanksgiving meal gives us even more data. And I have it described here as the kernel. Maybe it is the kernel, maybe it's not, but it certainly gives us a more illumination for what's actually happening in the Lord's Supper, or at least how early Christians were thinking about that. And of course, things evolve and develop, and we'll get into that starting next week. But so let me stop just for a second and see what kind of comments or questions you have before I turn to the very last thing I would like to discuss today.
Christian, just
Yeah.
a quick review of Leviticus 7. It does appear that it needs to be leavened bread. On the contrast, however, the day of Pentecost has a wave offering of 2 leavened breads. Now that you see the church coming into its fullness on the day of Pentecost. And so perhaps they are taking their cue from the day of Pentecost.
Well, I mean, what you allow for in Leviticus 7 is it allows for both unleavened and leavened bread. So if you go down into verses 13,
13, yep, has leaven cakes.
yeah, and so it's the possibility of having both. And of course, I've heard in like the theological explanation for why the Eastern churches use leavened bread is that Jesus used leaven as an image of the kingdom. And so that's why they've included it. And I think that's a great theological articulation of that. But I think the background then is, how do Jews, early Jews, which is what all the Christians were, how do they evolve their practice in such a way that they're willing to use both unleavened and leavened, especially if Passover is the principal background, where not only should you not have leaven in your bread, you can't have leaven in your house. Anyway, so so there are probably several backgrounds, but these are the two certainly that have become that have shown up the most, at least in the sort of the ecumenical scholarship that I've been looking at.
Christian,
Yeah.
There was a time when on the deacon board, the women were deaconesses, and they had to bake the loaves of bread for communion. And it was a lucky thing that it didn't have to be unleavened, because I don't think they'd come up with it.
Yeah, that's probably true. That's right. That's great though. That did they use our kitchen? Or would
No,
they do it at home?
we did it at home.
Oh, that's even better.
Well,
I would just say that's even better in the sense that it fits in with the Pauline sort of everyone has something to bring to the some bring a song, some bring a message, and then some obviously you're bringing the bread that's going to be used in this essential practice that we have.
and that was in the days where I believe we broke the bread apart, but you passed the bread, and people would tear a piece off, and that was then the doctors came up, said flu season, no. So
Christian, is a Tota is a Seder meal a Tota?
No.
No, it's not. The Seder is very specific to the Passover, and the question of precisely when the Seder developed is one that I've found in the scholarship is still an open question. In fact, some scholars are not even convinced that the Seder, the way that we see it today, is how Jesus experienced it.
Because isn't the Seder every week? I mean, isn't it every?
No, that's Passover.
No, the Seder meal is Passover. It's only once a year.
And the word Seder means order.
Right. That's right.
So the order of service. But the question I was having was the term love feast, and in relationship to having a weekly communion or gathering as part of, and I think that's kind of what Paul's talking about when he's saying you're doing this all wrong.
Yeah. So interestingly enough, so this is the last thing that I'm going to use that as a transition mark. And I would say probably one of the most, aside from learning about the Tota, one of the most fascinating things that I discovered as I was kind of doing my research was how important banqueting meals had become during this time in the area in which early Christianity arises and develops, right? So we might describe this as, this is a Hellenistic time period. I'm going to kind of give you some dates here in just a minute and tell you why. But basically what scholars have found is that over the course of about 200 or 300 years, effectively a series of associations, we might call them, we might even call them supper clubs, evolved and developed, and they had a very specific function. So let me kind of just introduce you to this information, because I think this kind of brings in one final sort of additional wrinkle that also touches to some extent on the point you were about to make, Tom, I think, regarding the centrality of meals, like a meal central kind of meal element that is going on far beyond the bounds of Judaism or Christianity. It's sort of going on throughout sort of the Roman Empire and areas east as well. So we have two biblical backgrounds, and then this one I would suggest provides a third useful background, at least as we think about how early Christians are engaging in this and maybe what it might say to us about the nature of the supper. So the early Christian practice of eating together, whether it's love feast, whether it's having the ritual meal, does find some echoes beyond the bounds of the church and even beyond the bounds of whatever form of Judaism you want to talk about. And that has to do with developments that are going on in the ancient world from about 323 BC up to about 200 AD. So that's the Hellenistic period. And that basically, this is the period basically in which Alexander the Great, who you've probably heard of before, from Macedonia, comes down, invades Greece, crosses over the isthmus, invades Asia Minor, Palestine, Egypt, Persia, takes it all the way, basically spreads his empire all the way up to the Indus River Valley in India. And what happens is that they create this massive transnational empire, one of the largest of its time. And that leads to significant breakdown at the local level for people, right? So you have these imperial invasions, imperial powers that are simply overwhelming and that cannot be resisted. They come in, and your localized identity, right? The way that you thought about yourself, you know, you're a local person who lives in this area, who speaks this language, who eats this kind of food, etc. When you have this massive thing come in and basically destroy, to a certain extent, a bit of that identity, it's going to create a problem. How do I figure out who I am, where I fit, etc. And so the argument is that these associations were developed as a kind of strategy for helping people deal with that fragmentation, right? So these were associations, and I'll give you sort of a sense about what these things looked like and how often they gathered. And they're very, very unique. And so this was actually the book that I was reading that I left on the plane, was one that was kind of detailing this. And I'll kind of go through some of the elements here that I think are, you know, illuminating to some extent for thinking about early Christian practice. So first of all, is that these associations gathered together pretty frequently. Now, we're not talking so much about people having them. So when you had a banquet meal is not the same thing as like an everyday meal. Like when you just sat down and had, you know, bread or whatever, and water with your family or whatever. It had to be something that was more than that, and yet it was not something that only happened once a year. So this is like, it would be like the, you know, maybe like a Rotary Club, you know, that you were connected to or something of that nature. But more than likely, some people, there's some data to indicate that people would have gone to these banquet meals 2 to 3 times a week. So it could be pretty frequent. And so that kind of helps us to start to think about, well, that's one of the reasons why early Christians are gathering and having a meal component every week, because it's sort of it's something that they would have been used to, because it's also something going on in the broader culture. The associations themselves could form around a variety of identities or dynamics. So one of those would be the honor-shame dynamic, and here I'm just referring to the sort of social structure, the way that the world worked in the ancient world, and that is that people sought to gain honor for themselves and avoid shame. And one way that they did that, particularly people who were more powerful or who were more wealthy, was that they gathered clients to themselves and they functioned as a patron. And so you would throw meals for that reason. Sometimes those meals may be for a birthday. Other times it may just be because you're a good guy, or, you know, whatever. So you could have that. You could also, though, have associations for certain kinds of vocations, right? So if you were a woodworker, or if you worked in stone, or if you were a ditch digger or something of that nature, you could have associations that wind up getting formed around this. You could also have associations that had regional or ethnic identities, and others that had or religious identities. Though almost every association and the meal that they have, which I'll describe in just a second, always has a religious sort of connotation to it. I think some of this also becomes helpful background for understanding some of what Paul is talking about in 1 Corinthians around food sacrificed to idols, those kind of things. So what was happening? Well, when you gathered in these associations, your relationships were being negotiated, sedimented, and sometimes innovated, right? And what I mean by that is that this is the place where people sort of figured out who they were in relationship to others, right? Were they important to others, or not important? Were they in a posture of subservience or equality, etc.? All of those things could be at play depending on the kind of association we're talking about. And you could also, in these groups, you could have these could be places where certain social taboos might be transcended or crossed over, right? So you could have, you might eat with people that you might not normally associate with beyond the association, right? Things that other people might potentially construe as scandalous, possibly. These are also places where wealth was spread and redistributed to a certain extent. There were a couple of associations I was reading about, one of which not only were people, going to come and have meals and be together, but one club actually guaranteed burial they guaranteed a burial spot for members of their association. So there could be all kinds of privileges that attach themselves potentially to these. You also have evidence, there's also evidence that folks from a lower class, like slaves, could have a significant function. So there's evidence of slaves functioning basically as the MC for an event. So they could take on a certain kind of leadership. They could be men and women, so you have a mix there. Most of them, as I said, included a religious component. And the typical spaces where they might be held were rented spaces. Most temples, by the way, had banquet rooms connected to them, and you could rent them out. Though Christians are obviously not going to go and do that. They're not going to be in the precinct of a temple, at least not as the community, though we know that that was an issue that was going on in some of the early Christian churches, if we read the letters of Paul. But also homes of the wealthy, or really successful associations might buy a specific building just to be used for their banquets. The structure of one of these was a meal, the deepnon, or the datenon, that word means meal, and then a symposium that happened afterwards, which was the time of discussion, of singing, of philosophical argumentation, and of drinking of wine. And so these two things were together. And the transition from the meal into the symposium was typically had with a prayer of some sort. This is where people also reclined, right? So this notion of reclining at the table. So there's a fair amount of evidence, like particularly, for instance, if we look at the Gospel of John, right? If we look at the Gospel of John and the scene of the Gospel of John, where we don't actually even have at the Last Supper Jesus breaking bread and passing around the cup. That's actually absent there. Rather, what we have is Jesus washing the feet of his disciples. So Jesus takes on the posture of a servant, right, while his disciples are reclining. And then after he does that, we have a very long discourse that Jesus, right, it's oftentimes called the high priestly prayer or the discourse of the Last Supper. And that actually has the structure of what you would talk about at a symposium kind of thing. So a lot of this kind of evidence then, if we have the Passover, we have the Jewish Tota, we have these Hellenistic banquet meals, there's a possibility that synagogue and church gatherings can be understood in some ways as an innovation or a variation on this broader element that had been developing, right? Where you have smaller groups of people who weren't necessarily going to a temple, but rather were getting together and holding festive meals with religious meaning, connotation, and that was part of what helped them actually to declare their identity and clarify who they were vis-a-vis the larger world and towards one another. So Passover, thank offering meals, and Hellenistic banquet meals. I think these are three helpful backgrounds as we begin to transition and turn towards what we're going to talk about next week. Let me just introduce one last thing, and then I'll let you ask questions. So basically, the last thing I want to introduce is pretty much the way that we're going to approach the themes of the supper over the next 3 weeks together. So there's all kinds of stuff going on. I mean, today might even feel a little bit like a shotgun. I apologize, it's not more like a bullet. It kind of spreads all over the place. But in terms of the way that ecumenical conversation has unfolded over the last 70 or so years, folks have settled on the idea that there are three significant elements, components that are happening in the Lord's Supper. And that's how we're going to approach the next 3 days. One is the thanksgiving that's offered to God. I'm going to talk then next week about Thanksgiving, how that connects to different things that we're doing in the Lord's Supper, things that we're saying, things that we're receiving, etc. And we'll be talking about creation itself, of course, which is a part of that process of giving thanks to God, etc. The second thing is the anamnesis or remembrance of Christ, right? So do this in remembrance of me, that we hear Jesus talking about, both in the context of the synoptic accounts, as well as in the little passage in 1 Corinthians 11, which is the earliest of all the passages that we have. So there's something going on about Jesus, about his death, his life, his resurrection, etc. That's also central, that we are meeting Christ or being met by Christ. And then lastly, the invocation or reception of the Holy Spirit, the gift of the Spirit. And so what eventually came to be called the epiclesis in the history of the church, which is the invocation of the Spirit and the gift of the Spirit. So we give thanks to God, we encounter Christ in this kind of anamnesis sense, and I'll talk about what does that look like, and then we receive something profoundly, right? So that's sort of the basic structure. It's very basic, right? Giving thanks to God, encountering Jesus, receiving the Spirit. Those three movements are going to be central. So if today felt a little bit crazy, I apologize. I've been a little bit crazy over the last week or so. I'm going to stop share on my screen here and just see what kind of comments or questions you might have. All right. Yes. Yeah. So my point was that if it felt a little bit crazy and scattershot today, I apologize. But seeing that structure, I hope will give you a sense that that's kind of how things are going to unfold, those three things. So any comments or questions that you have?
One of the elements that would be part of this would be just the weekly Sabbath meal. And since they're all, brothers and sisters now in the Lord, having that as a common fellowship time.
Indeed. That's right. That's right.
I'd just like to thank you for helping me separate the experience I have of communion from some of the theological baggage I've carried that I've been trying to understand. So thank you. Thank you for that.
Well, I hope it was helpful. What did I do? Did I say something? If I said something, you got to tell me what it is.
I won't take the time right now. I'll just email you.
Okay. All right. Jeff, it looks like you're leaning forward. Did you have a comment? I think, yeah, he leaned back. All right. Well, thank you so much. It's 12:30, so I think I've kind of kept you extra time. I apologize. And let me just pray us out together, and I'll hopefully see you next week. Lord, thank you for this day. Thank you for our time together. Thank you for the opportunity that we have to participate in the supper, and also to think about what it might mean and how it informs or should inform our lives. Help us as we go forth to find ways to strengthen our bonds with one another, to care for those who need care, and to stand alongside those who need a shoulder to lean on. We ask and pray all these things in your name. Amen.